What would happen if a man in a hoodie was denied a first-class seat and no one knew he was the very owner of the entire airline? A Boeing 787 was preparing for takeoff from LAX on a quiet afternoon when a sharp voice suddenly pierced the calm. "Sir, this area is for first-class passengers only." The tone was even but cold, coming from a flight attendant whose name tag read, Melinda Sharp. Under the soft lighting of the first-class cabin, the man seated in 1A looked up. His expression was calm, his eyes steady and unsurprised, his sun-worn face partly obscured by a dark knit cap and a plain hoodie. To Melinda, he appeared to be nothing more than a middle-aged traveler in faded jeans, no watch, worn-out sneakers, and nothing about him seemed to belong in a luxury seat. She repeated herself, this time with growing impatience. "Did you hear me? This seat is not yours." The man's voice was low but firm. "My name is Evan Monroe. First-class ticket, seat 1A. He held out a physical boarding pass, clearly printed with first class and a QR code already scanned at the gate. Melinda glanced quickly at it, frowned, and without checking the system, shook her head. "There may have been a mistake. I'll need to see some identification." The mood in the cabin began to shift. A woman in row 2 whispered to her husband, "He said it's first class." Meanwhile, 3 phones were quietly raised into recording position, and one younger passenger began live streaming. Melinda glanced at the camera, then turned back with more resolve. "We have reasons to be suspicious. Someone might have used a fake image or manipulated the system." Evan said nothing. He simply opened his worn leather briefcase under the seat and produced a platinum-colored membership card. The words Skyrise Air gleamed under the cabin light with the designation Platinum Legacy, 6 consecutive years. But to Melinda, it meant little. "These can be easily faked," she said with a loaded tone. "I'll call the captain." Still, Evan did not argue. But his gaze, once patient, had turned sharp. On his tray table he placed the boarding pass, the loyalty card, and his phone, all neatly displayed. In the cabin, a male passenger folded his arms and muttered loudly enough to be heard, "Guess he thought a hoodie could get him into first class." Evan remained still. The cameras continued to record, and the viewers had yet to learn that the man they were watching wasn't just another passenger. He was the founder of Skyrise Air. And this moment, right here in seat 1A, was about to shake the entire airline industry. Captain Colin Graves appeared just minutes after Melinda's brief call, stepping out from the cockpit with a face that made no effort to hide his irritation. He looked Evan Monroe up and down, his eyes carrying the subtle contempt of someone long accustomed to wielding authority and expecting absolute compliance. "Sir," he said in a flat tone, like reciting a delayed departure notice, "this seat is currently not assigned to you. Please cooperate to avoid delaying the flight." Evan met his gaze calmly, unmoved. "I've already provided all necessary documentation," he said, resting his hand lightly on the boarding pass and platinum membership card laid neatly on his tray. "If there's been a mistake, please verify it through the system. I'm not causing a disruption. I'm simply sitting in the seat I paid for." But Captain Graves didn't bother to pick up any of the documents. He shook his head, then turned to Melinda with a loaded glance. "Call security." The atmosphere in the cabin was now as tense as a courtroom hearing. A young man in row 2 whispered, "He already showed everything." An elderly woman in row 3 quietly recorded from behind her open book. The hashtag #seat1A began surfacing online, alongside captions like, "This man is being kicked out of first class for not looking the part." Evan calmly opened his phone's camera app and positioned it steadily, his voice clear and unwavering. "My name is Evan Monroe. I'm being asked to vacate a first-class seat that I paid for, with full documentation and membership status." There was no anger in his tone, no threat, only a quiet firmness that no one in the cabin could look away from. Melinda whispered into her radio, "Disruptive passenger, suspected ticket fraud, requesting support in first class." From seat 3B, a woman suddenly spoke up. "Could you check the system again? He's shown everything." Melinda turned sharply, her voice clipped. "Please do not interfere." But it was too late. Murmurs began to spread through the cabin. A passenger muttered, "Making a scene with someone like him. There's something off here." Meanwhile, Evan remained completely still. His phone kept recording. On the screen, the live stream view count had just surpassed 5,000. And down the aisle, 2 security officers were making their way forward step by step. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but everyone on board could feel it. Something much bigger was about to hit. 2 security officers appeared at the front of the first-class cabin in stark contrast to one another. Marcus Lynn, solid and composed, and Dana Liu, young, her gaze flickering between duty and uncertainty. "Sir, we need you to come with us to verify some information," Marcus said, in a calm, steady voice that held no threat, but made the request unmistakably clear. Evan nodded, calmly gathered his documents, and stood up without the slightest crack in his composure. As he walked out, the air in the cabin seemed to tighten, not because he was being removed, but because he handled it with such quiet dignity, such composure, that it left every other passenger feeling uneasy in his place. At Gate 47, a small cluster of passengers stood scattered around the waiting area. The digital screen overhead had just updated to read, "Flight Skyrise 207, boarding delayed." Standing at the gate was a familiar figure waiting for Evan. Sandra Pike, the shift supervisor for the airport and the designated authority in handling in-flight escalations. She was tall, poised, hair tightly pinned, her eyes betraying not a flicker of emotion. Taking the documents back from Marcus, Sandra glanced at them briefly before stating in a chillingly flat voice, "Mr. Monroe, while the documents appear to be valid, since you failed to comply with crew instructions, we are reassigning you to economy class or placing you on a later flight." Evan inhaled slowly, his gaze locking directly onto Sandra's. "I did not cause a disturbance. I sat in my assigned seat, presented full documentation, and cooperated fully. Requesting confirmation is my most basic right." Sandra did not answer immediately. She glanced at the growing number of phones filming the exchange, then said quietly, "You disrupted staff operations, and that constitutes disorderly conduct." Her words were caught clearly by a teenage boy live streaming from a nearby bench. Within minutes, the view count surged. From Twitter to TikTok, the hashtag #Gate47 began trending, captioned with phrases like, "They're kicking out a man for asking to verify his seat." Amid the quiet storm brewing beneath the surface, a firm female voice cut through. "I've witnessed everything from the start. He did nothing wrong." Stepping forward was Dr. Helena Reed, dressed in a white lab coat, ticket in hand, her expression unwavering. "You're removing a man from his flight because of how he looks, not how he acted." Sandra turned to her, sharp and cold. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." But Dr. Helena didn't flinch, didn't cower before the uniform. "Yes, it does," she replied simply. "Because I'm a passenger too, and I will not stay silent when injustice unfolds before my eyes." The confrontation was no longer between a passenger and an airline. Everyone in the waiting area was beginning to understand that what they were witnessing wasn't just a dispute. It was a reckoning with a culture of silence. And they were no longer just spectators. They were becoming witnesses to a moment far bigger than any boarding pass. Amid the heavy atmosphere suffocating Gate 47, Sandra Pike maintained a steady tone, as if reciting a scripted procedure. "There's nothing more we can do," she said. "This is an internal directive, and you are expected to comply." But Evan Monroe didn't respond immediately. He looked around, his gaze sweeping across the faces, filming, whispering, and questioning. Then, with rare composure, he took out his phone, opened the booking app, and displayed the screen confirming his seat, 1A, reserved 3 weeks in advance. There was no room for denial. Sandra appeared unimpressed. She turned away, ready to signal security to proceed with removing the passenger. But just then, a voice called out from near the window, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Wait a second, that watch he's wearing, that's not standard." All eyes turned to Evan. On his left wrist was a simple yet exquisitely crafted timepiece, its blue steel face understated with a handmade leather strap. Nothing flashy, but to those who knew, it was unmistakable. A Patek Philippe 5236P, a global limited edition available only to an exclusive list. Another passenger, a young businessman typing away on his laptop, suddenly looked up. He squinted at Evan, frowned, and began typing Evan Monroe into his browser. Almost instantly, the top search results appeared. Founder of Skyrise Air, Evan Monroe Aviation Disruptor. Monroe quietly owns 28% stake in Skyrise. The man muttered, "Oh my God, it's him?" Then turned to the person beside him, trying to mask his shock. This guy isn't just some passenger. He built the airline. The information spread like lightning. A student live streaming snapped his head up and tagged his stream. Breaking. Man removed from first class may be Skyrise Air CEO. Within 45 seconds, the clip racked up tens of thousands of views. But at the center of it all, Evan remained expressionless. He looked at Sandra and spoke with the softness of a passing breeze. "I suggest you take the call you're about to receive, and listen carefully." Sandra let out a dry, sarcastic laugh. "Is that a threat, Mr. Monroe?" Evan simply shook his head. "No, it's me saving your job." Inside, the departure screen now read, "Flight Skyrise 207, delayed 21 minutes. Outside, one by one, people began to understand. The silence of that man wasn't surrender. It was a warning. A rupture was forming beneath their feet, and it was about to erupt, not with a scream, but with a phone call. A soft chime from the walkie-talkie on Sandra Pike's shoulder pierced through the tension like a knife. "Supervisor Pike, you have a priority line connection from the CEO's office, line 1. The entire area seemed to freeze. Sandra's hand paused mid-air. She glanced instinctively at Evan. He stood there calmly, adjusting his sleeve as if preparing for a business meeting, not at the center of a public scandal. Sandra tapped her earpiece, her voice catching slightly. "Pike speaking." A female voice on the other end came through sharp as a razor, without any need for introduction. "This is Angela Ross from the CEO's office at Skyrise Air. Is Mr. Evan Monroe present at Gate 47 at this moment?" Sandra swallowed hard. Even the bystanders fell silent. A young mother holding her child stopped mid-motion. Those live streaming lowered their phones slightly to capture every word. Yes, he is," Sandra replied, unable to meet Evan's gaze. "Hand him the radio," Angela commanded. Evan took the walkie-talkie without hurry, without tension, calmly lifting it and speaking in a voice so steady it chilled the air. "Angela, I was just denied boarding on a first-class ticket that I paid for in full, despite presenting all valid documentation. I was treated like a fraud, confronted by security, and humiliated in public. And I'm not the only one this has happened to, but I'm the only one who's going to make you face it." There was a pause on the other end, as if Angela needed a second just to breathe. Then her voice returned, lower now. "We'll make it right. Evan, please tell me. What do you want?" Evan lifted his eyes, scanning the faces around him. Not just curious, but expectant. He knew then this conversation was no longer personal. It was a moment far greater than himself. He replied slowly, each word a declaration. "I want transparency. I want accountability. I want change. And I want it to start right here, Gate 47, in front of everyone watching." When he handed the device back to Sandra, she no longer stood as firmly. A light sheen of sweat glistened on her brow. Angela's voice returned, now with a tone that left no room for interpretation. "Ms. Pike, from this moment forward, every action you take will be monitored by senior executive leadership. Escort Mr. Monroe back to his seat. And say nothing more." Evan gave a slight nod, but he didn't walk away yet, because what he truly wanted had not yet been spoken. And that was going to shake far more than a single flight. It was going to shake the foundation of an entire industry. When Evan Monroe handed the radio back to Sandra Pike, no one spoke, no one moved. The entire Gate 47 sank into a deep silence, as if everyone was waiting for a signal, and Evan was the one holding it. He stepped up onto a low platform near the check-in counter, the LED board casting light across half his face, making his calm presence even sharper. Then he spoke, without a microphone, but each word rang out clearly. "I am not returning to that plane just to sit in a seat. I am returning to ensure no one else is ever treated the way I was, or the way so many have been quietly dismissed before me." A ripple stirred, but no one interrupted. Evan looked straight into the phone that was live streaming. "Angela," he said directly to the lens, as if the CEO's office was still listening, "I have 5 demands. If you want me back, if you want to protect this airline's reputation, if you want to hold on to the trust of the market, then it needs to start right here." He raised one finger. "First, immediately terminate Flight Attendant Melinda Sharp and Captain Colin Graves. No reassignment, no warnings. They did not just make a mistake. They became examples of bias and abuse of authority." The space fell into utter stillness. He raised a second finger. "Second, implement mandatory unconscious bias training for all customer-facing employees. Minimum 8 hours within the next 30 days. The third finger lifted. "Third, create an anonymous reporting platform for passengers and staff, where all incidents of discrimination can be documented, archived, and acted upon without fear of retaliation." Then the fourth, establish a $750,000 fund managed by an independent third party dedicated to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion policies within the organization. Finally, his hand closed, leaving only the index finger. Fifth, tie at least 20% of executive bonuses to measurable improvements in passenger equity scores. No progress, no payout. The entire terminal seemed to tremble with the vibration of phones, stunned murmurs, and soft sighs of relief, as if a silent weight had been lifted. A voice suddenly called out from the crowd, "This is how you change a system!" Another whispered in disbelief, "No one's ever done this in public before." Evan didn't smile. He didn't appear triumphant. He simply looked into the eyes of those filming, those waiting, and said quietly, "These are not conditions for me to be served. These are the conditions under which trust is restored." And with those words, he was no longer a CEO reclaiming a seat. He was a man rewriting the rules, at the very place where it all began. As Evan Monroe finished speaking, Gate 47 seemed to pause for a breath. What he had just said was no longer the complaint of a passenger treated unfairly. It was an ultimatum from someone who held real authority. A man near the check-in counter unconsciously lowered his phone and whispered, "He doesn't want revenge. He's laying out a roadmap for reform." And that was what sent chills down the spines of those truly in power on the other end of the line. Through Sandra Pike's earpiece, Angela Ross's voice returned, no longer cold but now slow and cautious. "All 5 conditions are accepted. Skyrise Air will fully cooperate. You have complete oversight." Sandra looked at Evan. He gave a slight nod, but his expression remained stern. "Good," he said, "but let me repeat. This isn't about showing power. This is about fixing a system that makes people believe they have the right to dismiss someone based on appearance, clothing, or because he doesn't look like what they think belongs here." Behind him, an older woman clutched her husband's hand, her voice trembling with emotion. "I saw someone pulled off a plane once just for speaking Arabic. They never got to board again." A young black man silently raised his phone higher, adding a caption. "He's not asking for justice for himself. He's asking for everyone who was ever silenced." Evan turned to Dr. Helena Reed, the woman who had spoken up from the start. His voice was quiet but full of gratitude. "Thank you for not staying silent. Most people don't." Helena nodded, her eyes misty. "You made it possible." Amid the crowd, a man in a suit quietly closed his laptop and muttered to himself, "I missed 2 major meetings because of this flight, but now it feels worth it." That single line seemed to untie something. A soft applause began in the back corner, spreading slowly across the waiting area. At first, it was agreement, then it became a wave of applause, not out of awe for power, but because someone had finally done what everyone should have done long ago. Evan did not bow. He simply nodded, then said, "I will oversee everything that was promised, and I will not do it behind closed doors. From today forward, everyone, passengers, employees, the public, will know what happens when an airline stops listening." In the corner of the digital screen, the flight status slowly updated. Flight Skyrise 207. Boarding resumed. Yeah, but those who were there that day knew the flight wasn't just boarding again. It was charting an entirely new course. 3 days had passed since the incident at Gate 47. In the office on the 31st floor of the Skyrise Air Building in Chicago, Evan Monroe sat in front of the glass wall overlooking Lake Michigan. The room was so still you could hear the rustle of pages turning. On the desk, a thick folder stamped "Urgent Internal" rested beside an untouched cup of coffee. The bold title on the cover read, "Reform Implementation Report, Initial Phase." His personal assistant, Maria Chen, entered quietly and spoke almost in a whisper. "They've completed everything you requested. All 5 items." Evan flipped to the last page, scanning the attached documentation, attendance sheets from the bias training program, termination letters for Melinda Sharp and Captain Colin Graves, all signed and executed. "Sandra Pike," Maria added, "has been reassigned to training oversight, just as you suggested." Evan neither nodded nor expressed satisfaction. He only asked, "Is the anonymous feedback system running yet?" Maria pulled out her tablet and showed him the screen. Over 120 reports submitted in the last 48 hours, with timestamps, locations, and preliminary categorization. On the large screen in the corner, a market graph showed Skyrise Air's stock price gradually recovering, climbing back into the green after the dip caused by the incident. News headlines flashed. From crisis to catalyst, CEO Evan Monroe turned scandal into aviation reform. But Evan wasn't celebrating. He gave no interviews, wrote no long posts on social media. To him, the real work was just beginning. Maria hesitated slightly before continuing. 6 other airlines have requested access to our bias training model. They're willing to pay for exclusive rights. Evan looked up and responded firmly. "Decline. We'll open source it, upload everything to the Ward Foundation platform. No one should have to buy what ought to be the standard." Maria nodded, asking nothing further. She knew that when Evan said standard, it wasn't a slogan, it was a blueprint. Evan rose and walked toward the glass wall. Below his feet, the city pulsed with motion, but something fundamental had shifted. Within the heart of the aviation industry, an old structure had just been dismantled, and its scattered pieces were being reorganized into something new, no longer driven by unconscious bias, but by visible fairness. And that, Evan knew, would not stop at Skyrise, because if change could start with a single seat, then it could reach the entire sky. 2 months after the incident at Gate 47, more than 800 delegates gathered in the main hall of the National Civil Rights Conference held in Memphis, Tennessee, a solemn space where every voice not only gets heard but carries real weight. On stage, there were no flashy banners, no hollow slogans, just a single sign that read, "Equity in Transportation. The future begins today." And standing at the podium was Evan Monroe, not wearing a lapel mic, no teleprompter, just his natural voice, steady and honest, eyes meeting each listener directly. "When people say change is slow," Evan began, "they're usually thinking it's someone else's responsibility." A wave of silence spread through the hall. No one looked at their phones. No one looked away. Evan moved to the first slide, a chart showing that complaints of discrimination in the airline industry had dropped by 68% in just 8 weeks since the Gate 47 event. "This number," he said, "wasn't achieved through press releases. It came from action, training, oversight, and most of all, commitment." The next slide showed images. Skyrise employees in unconscious bias training sessions, new signage in airports reading, "Respect is a standard, not a privilege," and passengers of diverse backgrounds boarding flights without suspicious stares. The room was filled with a silence of gratitude, but the most unexpected moment came right after. A woman slowly stepped up from the audience. She wore a simple black dress, no makeup, her face tense yet determined. She held a microphone. took a deep breath, and spoke. I'm Melinda Sharp. I was the lead flight attendant on Skyrise 207, and I was wrong. The hall didn't erupt in whispers. No one booed. They waited. I judged a man by his hoodie, she said, voice trembling but clear. I didn't just fail in my role of service. I failed as a human being. I lost my job, and I deserve that. But after leaving Skyrise, I spent all my time relearning everything. Today, I train new flight attendants, so they never become the version of me that day. No one clapped. They stood, not because she was a hero, but because she had the courage to face her failure and choose a different path. Evan looked at Melinda, no blame in his eyes, only a quiet nod, enough to say, I see you. He moved to the next slide. A handwritten letter, the paper wrinkled and folded like it had lived inside a wallet for a long time. He read aloud, I watched the Gate 47 video from my college dorm. 2 years ago, I was thrown off a train for looking suspicious. I said nothing, but after watching you, I spoke up. I filed a report. Now I'm building a database of discrimination incidents in transportation. I named it Gate 47. Layla Hampton, age 21, Boston. In that profound silence, Evan lifted his head and looked straight into the camera lens. To anyone sitting in a small seat in a system not built for you, your story doesn't have to stay silent, because change doesn't need to scream, it needs to endure. And this time, when the applause rose from the back rows, no one remained a spectator. They were all walking with him now, toward a new chapter they themselves were ready to write. When Evan Monroe left the stage, there was no dramatic mic drop, no stage lights shifting to signal a climax. He simply stepped down with calm, deliberate strides and reached out, grasping the hand of a group of students waiting below. One girl held a hand-drawn sign in marker that read, in messy but heartfelt lettering, You gave us tools, not just words. Evan looked at it for a moment, then nodded, as if he had just received the most meaningful gift of his entire journey. The next morning, at O'Hare Airport, a new billboard appeared. White background, black text, no flashy graphics. Just one simple sentence. Respect is not a reward, it's your ticket. People walked by, read it, snapped pictures, shared them. Some didn't know the full story, but felt something stir inside. And those who had followed the journey from Gate 47, they understood this sign wasn't a reminder of an event. It marked a cultural turning point. Back in his office, Evan Monroe received an email from Angela Ross. Subject line, Full implementation plan. Attached. The body was brief, ending with a single line. You didn't just challenge us. You redefined what it means to lead. Evan read it, then closed the email without replying. Not out of coldness, but because his work there was done. He stepped away from his desk, walked to the tall glass window, and looked out at the city moving like a constant current. Below, Skyrise planes still took off, but now carrying something that couldn't be measured in revenue, trust. 2 months later, the anonymous reporting system had logged over 700 submissions, not only from Skyrise, but from other airlines beginning to adopt the same reform model. 5 major domestic transportation companies had signed on to implement standardized bias training. On the digital display inside the Ward Foundation's control room, a corner of the screen blinked with the words, Inspired by Gate 47. The story was no longer Evan's. It had become a movement, a foundation where those once left behind could now step forward without asking permission. And when someone asked him after the speech, Have you thought about running for office? Evan simply smiled, so faintly it was almost inaudible, and said, No, I'm not here to campaign. I'm here to build systems that don't need heroes. The story didn't end with applause, but with continuation. Because real change doesn't spread through views, it advances through action, quietly, persistently, and without turning back. And in that way, Gate 47 is not just where it all began, it is where history split into a new direction. In the airline industry, where every seat is measured in numbers, there are things invisible yet far more valuable: fairness, trust, and the way a person is seen before they even speak. Evan Monroe's story is not just a counterstrike from a place of power, but a lesson for every system. If you fail to confront internal bias, it will eventually tear your brand apart from the outside. If you believe that real change begins with quiet but unwavering action, then like this video, subscribe so you won't miss what comes next, and leave a comment with these 3 words: worth far more.